Good morning. This is Our Talk. This is our second edition. I'm Charles McCullough. Proud to have you with us on AM 1540 KGBC Galveston. This is a very, very significant weekend and a date in Galveston, but also Texas, American history. And I have a very, very special guest, somebody, she and her husband, both of whom I admire very much, have known for more than 30 years. Since, again, back at the old studios of KGBC on Pelican Island long ago, when Vandy Anderson would be on the mic talking about hurricanes from Hurricane Alicia to every event that happened since. We're used to hurricanes on the upper Texas coast. We're used to hurricanes on the Gulf Coast. It's an event that you have to be ready for and you know about. We've already seen developments in our first hurricane with Hurricane Hermine already going into Florida this year. So we're used to that kind of thing. We've had Hurricane Ike back in 2008. But you know, an event happened 5 days from now on September 8th, 116 years ago, that on the one hand is captured in black and whites with stiff-looking people that seem foreign to us and far removed from our current event. But in reality, it was a flesh and blood hell on earth, and the worst natural disaster still in American history, the great 1900 storm. Miss Linda McDonald joins me this morning. Linda is the nation's leading expert on the 1900 storm. She'd be the last person to describe herself with those kind of accolades, but it's the truth. If you've seen the Weather Channel, you've seen Linda discussing the 1900 storm event and special coverage that they've occasionally or periodically offered, certainly will through this next week. And Linda, it's an honor to have you and your husband join us this morning on this somber occasion, but an event we can still learn so much from. The great 1900 storm, September 8th, 1900. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you, Charles. It's an honor being here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, ma'am. Linda, let's go back past 2008, back past 1962. Let's go back past 1935, back before 1915, before 1900. We're going back to the 1890s. Galveston, the pearl of the Gulf Coast. 1837 founded and coming forward. It was already 63 years old. People had high hopes. It was the leading banking center of the South. It was New Orleans before New Orleans ever got its sea legs under it. Tell us about Galveston back in that time.
Well, Galveston was just a fantastic city. It was a primary port of entry. In fact, 95% of all goods and immigration coming into the state of Texas came in through the port of Galveston. It was
90%.
95% actually of all goods and immigration coming into the Southwest, coming into Texas, came in through the port of Galveston. It was the primary port for Texas.
The Wall Street of the South.
Well, that's true. The Strand, Avenue B in Galveston, which, by the way, was called the Strand because it reminded people of a street in London known as the Strand. And so Galveston was the Wall Street of the Southwest. It was just, it was an era of grandeur, of opulence, grace, and charm. There were magnificent castle-like houses, quaint Victorian cottages. There were large churches, majestic churches. The largest Catholic church in the state of Texas, Sacred Heart, was located in Galveston. Almost every first that happened in the state of Texas happened in Galveston. So it was just this fantastic place. And it was one of the largest cities in the state of Texas, but it was also one of the richest cities per capita in the United States.
What was our population at that time?
The population in 1900 was 36,000.
The population today is about 67,000.
Yeah. And that was the actual population of people living there. Of course, during the summer, the population swelled because so many people came down to Galveston.
Even then?
Oh, yes. It was wonderful. They loved coming to the beaches. And in fact, there were large sand dunes along the beachfront in the 1880s. And those sand dunes, many of them, were removed to improve access to the beach. And of course, that proved to be
It was a natural seawall, wasn't it?
Yeah, detrimental to the city during the 1900 storm.
What was Galveston's quote unquote hurricane civic awareness in 1890? They had, from 1837 or further back than that forward, Galveston certainly must have been and had been plagued by tropical events. Nothing that caused the havoc that we'll talk about in a moment of the 1900 storm. But what was Galveston's level of preparation like? What was the awareness like? Certainly there had been knowledge of what things that happened in Cuba, Florida, New Orleans. Where was Galveston mentally in 1899?
Well, there had been storms before, and actually they were called overflows. They didn't have hurricanes then, they had overflows.
What is that?
That's a hurricane. That
Thank you.
Comes in and...
I am an no. Yes, ma'am.
So they had overflows, and the worst one before the 1900 storm was in 1875, and that was major. And after the hurricane of 1875, a lot of people talked about building a seawall, doing something to protect the city from future overflow.
Had that been the first time, and even 50 years prior to that anyone had discussed anything like that?
To any great extent, yes. But of course, there was the cost. There was the concern that a seawall would detract from the beaches and would limit the tourist business.
Let's talk about transportation. What was it like back then? How were people coming to Galveston? What would be the typical scenario where someone from Houston or around the way would, well, we're going to head down to Galveston and enjoy the sand dunes?
They could take the train, and most people at that time used carriages or horses in Galveston. But one of my favorite folks in history was the man who laid out the streets of Galveston in 1839. And this surveyor, who was contracted to do the job, was asked to lay out the city in very, very simple grid plan. Mm-hmm. So he went as far as he could to the east, and he labeled that first street 6th Street because he wanted to leave room for growth. Then he went all the way to 57th Street.
Okay.
Then he went to the wagon trail along the bay, and he called that first street A because he'd already used up the numbers going one way, so he went A, B, C, D, and so forth. But this surveyor used to come up with inventions, and one of his inventions was to put ship sails on a wagon to help him speed down the beach. So that was one way to travel. The other thing was this man preferred to ride a pet bull. Now, in 1855, he came up with a way to condense milk, and the people of Galveston said, "I don't think so, not from a man who rides on a bull."
Okay.
But this surveyor, whose name was Gail Borden, said, "Well, I'm going to take my invention to New York City." And the people of Galveston said, "Well, that's the last we're going to hear of Borden and that milk company."
My goodness, what a story. Oh, wonderful event. And the nation as a whole, so many things were happening in the 1800s. Thomas Edison, everything was starting to come. There were the Duesenbergs and a lot of things beginning to develop in terms of the gasoline turbine engine, cars starting to develop, early automobiles. It was the country felt like it was about to explode with all kind of possibilities. And I know that in the 1890s, Galveston was right on top of feeling as if the future indeed really was our oyster.
It was the star in the crown of Texas.
How did Galveston at that time relate to other cities in the South, of Savannah, Georgia, coming around the Gulf Coast, Mobile, Biloxi? It's in a way, it's part of that old South continuum with the old beautiful homes, but there's a different character for Galveston. It's uniquely its own, and always had been and was in the 1890s also.
Well, I think one of the things about Galveston is its position as a port city, and it shares that with other coastal large cities. In that because of so many immigrants coming into Galveston, that there is such a diversity that people learned to get along, and there were many different nationalities, but also it was the hurricanes. Such as the 1900 storm, because it said in Galveston, you know, the people who drowned together learned to live together. And that happened in 1900, and we can certainly look back on Ike and all of the spirit of cooperation of people. I mean, we'd be working on one house, and someone would come and say, you know, I need help doing this, and all of us would go down and help that person, and people were working together, and that's part of the characteristic of Galveston
That makes it kind of unique, because it's the only one of any of the towns I might have just mentioned that had that experience. You know, to now go back and focus on 1900 and September 8th, let's jump forward all the way to 2008 to Hurricane Ike, and come back and then focus. We take a look at Hurricane Ike, 140, 35-mile-an-hour winds, similar to Alicia, but Ike brought this huge ground swell of water. Galveston by that time had a seawall, but still much destruction. The beautiful Balinese room totally destroyed. We still have the precious memories of all of the things that have uniquely been Galveston all through this time. But many people think of Ike as, quote unquote, I've heard this saying, the 1900 storm without the wind. Let's talk about Ike and then Carla, and go backwards, and then look at what the unique monster that was the 1900 overflow, or the 1900 storm. How did Ike compare with the 1900 storm?
Well, of course, for Hurricane Ike, we had the seawall, which helped to protect people. And what's interesting is we live just a few blocks off the beach, off from the seawall. And I had people, friends in Houston, because I was working in Houston at that time, just say to me, oh, we were so concerned because you're so close to the Gulf. And no, the floodwaters came up from the bay. But that's a concept that a lot of people off the island.
It's a frontal thing. It's got to be from the front, but it was right in.
The water was rising from the bay. And so we saw that in Ike, and the waves were certainly crashing against the seawall, and you know, some were coming over. It was the sight of the waves was just awesome. And it's a Galveston thing, I believe. But like Bill and my aunt and I went out to the seawall to watch the waves, come over the seawall. It was just an awesome sight. And I remember in Hurricane Carla in 1961, riding on my bicycle with friends to go to the beach right before the storm came to watch the waves come over the seawall. And a whole bunch of us, we were in the 9th grade, rode down to the ferry. And we took one of the last ferries over. It was great. The waves were splashing over. And then I thought, oh my gosh, my mom is going to kill me when she finds out we did this. And I talked to her about it, and she said, it's just a thing. She said, I did the same thing in the early 40s. You know, there was a storm coming, so all of my friends from high school, we went down to the seawall and we watched the waves. So, and my grandfather too, playing in the streets during the 1900 storm.
Yes, ma'am. And then we go back to Carla. Let's compare Carla in 61 to Ike, and then let's jackknife again another 50, 60 years backwards.
Okay, well, Carla stayed out in the Gulf for a while, building speed, and then it hit. There was a lot of the main flooding was on the mainland. Galveston had some flooding, but nothing. I mean, we were on 34th and P and a half. We had no flooding. We didn't even have the water come over the curb. My aunt, who lived on Sycamore Street in Gulf Village, for Carla, she had no water in her house, so she felt safe there. But she wanted to be with us, so she came to stay with us. But she ended up having like 3.5 feet of water in her house, and she couldn't believe it because she said, we were here for Carla, and we were fine, but here for Ike, it flooded.
Goodness gracious. Hurricane Carla, and that's a big event in many people's memories still. For younger people today, Hurricane Ike is their bellwether, if you will, and Alicia in 83. Now, it seems every 30 years a weather event like this would tend to happen. Would that be what a lot of meteorologists would faithfully say, Miss Linda, that if you go back from 2008 to 25 years within that 30-year range to maybe 83 with Alicia, and then another 23, 4 years back to Carla from there, are we looking at an event maybe 1937, 35? Is that another? And then we go back to 1915 and further back?
Yeah. What was, I'm pretty good on, but what's to be, I haven't got a clue. So I don't know. I will say that it's good to keep one eye looking over your shoulder to see if there's a storm in the Gulf and just what's happening.
One half closed and the other half open.
Right. And always be prepared.
Well, how was Galveston prepared for anything from a rainstorm to an overflow, as hurricanes were called, according to Miss Linda here, in the 1890s? Overflows were what they were called. Tropical cyclones. How was Galveston prepared on September the 7th of 1900?
Well, on September the 7th of 1900, Dr. Isaac Klein of the Weather Bureau raised the hurricane warning flag, and that told the people of Galveston that there was a storm in the Gulf. Now, the Weather Bureau was aware of the storm back on September the 4th. But it was on September the 7th that they raised the hurricane warning flag. Now, Galveston's growth had been because of its proximity to the sea. I mean, it was a port city, natural harbor, and that's what made Galveston grow. But now that same proximity to the sea was to change Galveston Island forever.
Let's back up to September 4th, 1st. Let's go back out to the Cape Verde Islands, Western Africa, and let's trace this storm that kind of came off and started coming west. When did we first, nowadays we can practically look at there's a small, there's like a little twister coming right off of Western Africa. That's probably going to develop into something. We can almost look at it from a Google Earth map now and know exactly what's going to happen. I think, metaphorically speaking anyway. But back then, when did one first become aware of a overflow or a hurricane event, and how were they becoming aware of it?
Well, first off, people saw the hurricane warning flags flying from the top of the Levy building where the Weather Bureau was located. And there had been a notice in the paper. But, they said, oh, we've had storms before. We've had lots of storms. Remember the great storm of 1875, which is kind of what we do now. We hear about a storm. Yeah, remember Ike? Ooh, remember Carla, Alicia. It's always that remember what happened then. And that was back then. But this is now and we're fine.
Every 25, it's a generation. It's a whole new thing. Oh, that was then. That was, here we are. Hey, it's a beautiful day. Let's go down and go down to the beach.
They knew it was coming, and it was a Saturday. September the 8th was a Saturday. Most people went to work. Most people worked half a day, or or maybe a whole day on Saturday. So people went to work. It was a normal day. Now the water was rising, and great waves were starting to crash on the South Shore. But again, people went to the beach. Let's go look at the water. Did you hear that the waters are breaking on the...
What was the horizon looking like then? Was there anything out there that were the skies looking a little bit darker, a little bit more ominous, or by that was the sun still up, and was it just a big high tide at that point?
Well, the night before, on September the 7th, Isaac Klein had looked at the sky, trying to see if there was that reddish brick tint that usually came before a storm, and it wasn't there. So he was feeling pretty good, although the waves were rather high that night. On September the 8th, beginning at 4 o'clock in the morning, Isaac Klein's brother Joseph, who lived with him at the Klein home, Isaac Klein was married and had 3 children, and his wife Cora May was expecting their 4th child, and his brother Joseph lived there with him and also worked in the Weather Bureau. Joseph Klein woke up, and he had this feeling of impending doom, of disaster. Something's wrong. So he woke Joseph up, and he said, something isn't right. So they got up, and they walked to the beach. They lived 4 blocks from the beach. It's in the area of 25th and Avenue Q, but back then it was 4 blocks from the beach. And when Isaac Klein saw the dark clouds, the wind increasing, and he noted that the wind was coming in strong from the north. Now, usually when this happens, people in Galveston can tell you, when the wind comes in from the north, it pushes the waves down, it flattens them out, and it pushes the Gulf farther south. But that's when it's so good for looking for shells. But that didn't happen this morning. On September the 8th, the wind was coming in strong from the north, driving in the waters of the bay, but the South Shore, the Gulf side, was very turbulent, and giant waves were crashing on the South Shore. So Dr. Klein realized that when the wind shifted and came in from the south, that Galveston would be in for a terrible storm.
Dr. Klein, at that point, actually was singularly the only human being in Galveston or in upper Texas coast areas that had that kind of calculation?
Dr. Klein was just an incredible individual, very well respected in Galveston. He had been in the Weather Bureau for 18 years, 11 years in Galveston. He was a very methodical individual. He believed that you should spend 8 hours every day working, 8 hours every day sleeping, and 8 hours every day doing something involving recreation.
Okay.
And he defined recreation as anything that you did to improve your mind, body, or spirit. So for recreation, he went back to school, and he got his PhD, he got his medical degree, always studying.
We're right up to that event, coming into 4 o'clock in the morning on September the 8th and kind of backing up to September 7th. Days before, how was Dr. Klein, and what was the intelligence involving the passage of this storm over Cuba and in the Western Caribbean, coming over Cuba, and then was this event going to go north, southeast? Or did we have a calculation at that time as to where it was going or where it had been, or was the only calculation we had the reports of people that said after the fact, like in Cuba, we just had a storm? And was that the first time we knew that there was this storm?
That was pretty much it. It was very primitive by our standards today.
Yes, ma'am.
And even our standards today, when you think about looking on your cell phone or on the TV to get radar, we have to remember that being able to see the radar on TV only goes back to 1961 and Hurricane Carla. Wow. And Dan Rather was the first one to show radar on television, and there was a big to-do about whether it should be done or not. And many people there, station said, no, don't do it, it's too frightening. But he did it. And so that's a recent event. But back then, no, you didn't have any of that. At that time in 1900, they didn't even have the intelligence coming from the ships that would be in the Gulf, to say, oh, the storm is awful, this, that, or the other. But no, but they did receive word from Cuba. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about whether those facts were ignored because it was from Cuba and what do they know in Cuba and all that. But the intelligence at that time, such as it was, showed the storm hitting north. It was over Cuba.
Maybe New Orleans.
But it was hitting north. They were thinking more Florida. It was going to go straight north, and that's where it was headed. But then later, they found out it had shifted and was going northwest, so that Galveston could be in the path. And so Isaac Klein did what he could. And
where was Dr. Klein originally from?
You know, I'm trying to remember. I know
It seemed like he had left from somewhere and then came down, and then I know he left after the storm, but I know that for Linda, for yourself, and experts like yourself, the fact that he was in Galveston at the time is what is all that matters, and so he's from Galveston.
He's from Galveston.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, after the storm, he became chief of the Weather Bureau in New Orleans.
Yes, ma'am.
And so that was, but again, he was so respected in Galveston, and I know that my family always spoke of him in the highest regard.
Miss Linda, let's talk about your family. Your grandfather was living in Galveston. Let's talk about him, talk about your family, and we telescopically looking at Galveston as a whole. Let's now look at your family in Galveston in August through September, around Labor Day weekend of 1900.
Well, I first learned about the 1900 storm, and my grandfather just called it the storm. But every time he said the storm, you knew which one he was talking about. But I learned about it from my grandfather, and that created a passion in me to learn all I could. And I was about 3 years old when he first told me about it. My father had served in World War II. And when the war ended, he came home, and a year later I was born. And then, because my father stayed in the reserves, he was called back during the Korean conflict. So my mother and I stayed with her parents, who lived down the street. And so that gave me an opportunity to be there with my grandfather.
What was their family name, or this?
Lacombe.
Yes, ma'am.
And they had the old French Lacombe bakery.
Oh, man.
And so my grandfather would tell me these stories. And my grandfather was not a storyteller, and he did read books to me. But when he would talk about the 1900 storm, he did it with such a fixation, a trance. It wasn't that he was just telling about something that happened. It was as though he were reliving it. And so I was fascinated, not just in the stories and what he said, but in the way that he talked about the storm. And I could tell that this was special. And my grandmother told me years and years later that my grandfather had never talked to her or to anybody about the 1900 storm. And I said, well, why me? And she said, well, it could be that we had just observed the 50th anniversary of the storm, and maybe that brought it all back to mind, but he hadn't talked about it before. But my grandfather told me, and this always got to me, he said the sounds were awesome. He said it sounded like 1,000 demons screaming in the night. And he said he would hear children calling for help. He would hear women begging for help, and he would hear men begging for mercy from God. And he said he would hear those sounds very faintly off in the distance, and then they would get louder and louder as people floated by. And he said many times those sounds would be abruptly cut off. And then he knew someone's life had ended. He said the sounds were awesome. He said the howling of the winds and the crying of the houses. And my grandfather had a wonderful sense of humor. And I remember when he said that very distinctly, because I said, Grandpa, you're pulling my leg. I know, because houses don't cry. And he remained so serious. And he said that night, everything cried. Wow. So I had to ask. I said, Grandpa, did you cry? And my grandfather told me that he lived above the bakery that his dad operated downstairs. And he was upstairs with his mom and his dad and his brother, James. And he said the house started to just kind of creak and shift. And he said the floodwaters had already filled the first floor. And he said he realized that if he were downstairs, the waters would be over his head, and that frightened him very much. He said, but they were all huddled together, and then all of a sudden his father leaped up, and his father ran to the pantry, and he got an axe, a hatchet, and a crate opener that had a little hatchet-type thing on the end. And he gave the hatchet to my grandfather's brother, James, and put him down near the front door, and he said, chop through the floor. And then he gave the crate opener to my grandfather and put him down the floor by the parlor. And he said, cut through the floor. And then he said he watched his father go into the dining room, throw back a chair, kick back the rug, and send the axe into the floor. And he said he and his brother were just frozen. They were watching their father cut through the floor. But his father saw that they were not doing what they were supposed to. So the dad turned and said, cut through the floor. And he said, so they started chopping. And he said the harder he chopped, the harder he cried. And he said it wasn't just that they were afraid they were going to die. He said, we knew we were going to die. He said, but we're all going to die insane. This is crazy. But of course, what happened was they cut through the floor, and the flooding waters came up through those holes, settled the house down, and it's probably what saved their lives.
Mr. Lacombe started noticing about what time in the early morning hours of September 8th, I believe that your grandfather's experience would mirror that of almost every other Galvestonian at that time. At what point you see the water start rising a little bit, maybe in the afternoon, evening of September 7th? You're walking down A Street on the Bay Side. You're walking down the Strand. Water starting to come up a little bit, and you maybe up above to your ankles. It's just a big rainstorm. Something's going on. Water's coming up. No big deal. When did people start realizing that it was a big deal? And then after midnight, when did people start realizing that, to the point of Mr. Lacombe, your grandfather and his family, taking the measures that you just described, ma'am? When was the first awareness that we are under a huge assault?
My grandfather was 6 years old, so for him, the start of the storm was fun.
His father was...
His father owned the bakery. My great-grandfather, Bernard Lacombe, had the bakery, but my grandfather was only 6 years old. So for him, wow, look at this. The streets are starting to flood. This is great. So he said he went outside with his brother, and there were kids out there, and they got sticks, and they floated them down the street. And what was so different about this particular flooding is that there was a current to it. So to them, these were great ships at sea, and they would sail them down the street. And he was having a great time. But then the water kept rising, and the wind picked up.
This is on September 7th, before sundown.
This is the 8th. This is September the 8th. This is the morning of September the 8th. He was playing in the street.
8 or 9 in the morning, maybe.
Yeah,
okay.
Even up to 10, because he said that the wind started increasing and it started to rain. And he said it wasn't fun anymore. And he said he was relieved when his mother called him in for lunch. because he didn't want to be out there. Something changed, and it became spooky for him, and he went inside the house. But he was sick, so that he didn't really know or understand.
Right.
There was a man who worked as an orderly at St. Mary's Hospital, Zachary Scott, and he was getting ready to start medical school later, and he had the weekend off, and so he said, I'm going to go get a ticket. I'm going to go home to Waco for the weekend. And he went to the train station, and they told him, and this is 10 o'clock in the morning, and they told him that no more trains, because while the tracks in Galveston were still okay, the tracks on the mainland were already 4 feet underwater. So he returned to St. Mary's to help out during the storm.
Your research began at what point following being 3 years old and on in later years, Miss Linda? When did that spark reignite to go back and do the in-depth research into the storm and how it impacted so many other families in Galveston?
Well, I would have to thank the Congregation of the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word. They're the ones, I love the stories, and I have collected books and stereo slides. That's one of my favorites.
Oh, man.
So I collect these pieces. I've read all that I've been able to find about the 1900 storm. And in a lot of cases, there were the books that were done right after the storm that have some good, some totally false information in them, but I enjoy reading them. So there was that part. But when I started to work for the sisters,
the first time I met you, you were working at St. Mary's Hospital back in the accounts table of burn.
I worked in
marketing.
I was director of communications, the director of hospital relations for the sisters, and actually I worked for the sisters for 27 years. I just recently retired. But it was the congregation that lost 10 sisters and 90 children at St. Mary's Orphanage. So the storm is very personal to them. I mean, people in Galveston who have family members, and I believe you had folks who went through the 1900 storm.
Yes, ma'am.
It's very special, and there's a certain bond with that. But, the congregation, those sisters, have probably been the most faithful group in remembering those who went through the storm. Because at that orphanage, the children and the sisters sang Queen of the Waves, an old French hymn. And it was what the sisters did to try to calm the children down. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the waves lifted the orphanage and it crashed to pieces. And so many children died. But ever since that time, on the anniversary of the storm, on September the 8th, wherever they are in the world, and they're in 5 countries, the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word will stop and sing Queen of the Waves. And they pause and remember the children and the sisters and all those who faced the great 1900 storm.
One of the buildings nearby, what was St. Mary's Hospital at that time and for so many years after, is Old Red from the University of Texas Medical Branch. That building actually survived the 1900 storm. Of the historical structures, looking at the buildings, when we're talking about buildings, as Mr. Lacombe Sr. indicated, your great-grandfather, and your grandfather passed on the knowledge that the buildings cried too. What structures that were historical buildings actually survived, and what percentage of, and then we'll talk about the real devastation with not 6,000 actually, but it was far more than that, 10,000 perhaps more people that passed away in the storm. But the Galveston was basically annihilated.
Yeah. Well, the the buildings that had been constructed by Nicholas Clayton did the best. And that included Old Red and St. Mary's Hospital.
The St. Mary's, too.
Yes, so thank goodness for Nicholas Clayton.
And Mr. Clayton was basically...
Mr. Clayton was the first professional architect in the state of Texas. And he came to Galveston to do some work, and he loved it and decided to stay. He was originally from Ireland and came over with his mom and served in the Union Army. We don't hold that against him. But he was like a drummer boy. And but then he came to Galveston and worked on different structures. He designed the incredible Ursuline Academy. Oh, which was gorgeous, and survived the 1900 storm, but was so severely damaged in Hurricane Carla in '61 that it was torn down. But his building, his design of Old Red was magnificent, and it had these giant towers on the top, very ornate, as was the style at that time. But during the 1900 storm, those towers came crashing down and ended up in the basement. So there was a lot of destruction.
Yes, ma'am. Would you say that more than 90% really of the structure, there was as the waves came in and the devastation started increasing, afternoon, you go toward the afternoon, when did it become a point where Isaac Klein was running around the beach almost like Paul Revere? The anecdotal stories are he was on a horse trying to alert people to, if possible, safely leave, do the best you can. Is that, in fact, a true story? And illuminate us as to when he was doing that and how much time there actually might have remained after he did that for people to actually have taken his advice.
Well, after their early morning visit to the beach, Isaac asked his brother Joseph to go on to the weather station. And then Isaac hitched his horse to a two-wheel cart that he used for hunting and fishing on the west end of the island. And he went around the beachfront telling people, seek higher ground, move into the heart of the city, seek higher ground. And that was in the early morning. But remember, higher ground in Galveston at that time was very relative. I mean, the beachfront was 2.5 feet above sea level. Downtown area was 5.5 feet above sea level. The highest elevation in the whole city was at around 13th and Broadway, 14th, 13th, in that area, and it was 8.7 feet. So 8.7 feet is the highest point in the city of Galveston, and somewhere out in the Gulf is a tidal surge of almost 20 feet coming full force for Galveston. So that's...
Take us to about 6 p.m., 7 p.m., September 8th. By now, as the sun started to set, and sadly it was when night fell that really hell on earth prevailed.
Well, backing up on Isaac Klein, he went to the Weather Bureau, and there at the Weather Bureau, in addition to Joseph Klein, was John Blagden. And John had been in the Weather Bureau in Galveston only a short time, and his family hadn't joined him yet. So from there, Isaac Klein composed a message to the Weather Bureau saying that he had never seen the Gulf rise in the face of such opposing winds. And he said he guessed that Galveston was half underwater. And he gave the message at around 3:30 in the afternoon. He gave it to his brother Joseph and said, send this to Washington. And he said, I'm going to go home to be with Cora May and the children because his wife was pregnant. He wanted to be with her. And John Blagden said, y'all both go because, I can stay here. I don't have family here. Joseph tried sending the message, but at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, all the telegraph lines were down. So he was able to find one telephone line still open, and he called a message to Houston and asked them to relay it. After he made that call, all the telephone lines were down. And now at 3 o'clock, 3:30 in the afternoon, Galveston's isolation was complete. And there would be no more communicating with the mainland for another 24 hours. And when that message was received, it was so devastating as not to be believed. Now, when Isaac Klein walked home, he realized that he had made a mistake, and he didn't make many mistakes. But he had said in that message that Galveston was half underwater. But it wasn't. Galveston was completely underwater in the middle of the afternoon. The waters of the bay had met the waters of the Gulf, and now Galveston was no longer an island. It was simply a part of the ocean floor with odd-looking buildings protruding from a very rough surface. When Isaac Klein got home, he found 50 people in the house. They knew that Isaac Klein had built that house to withstand the high wind and the high water, and they said, if there's, with your attention to detail, if there's any house in this whole city that's going to stand, it's going to be yours. And Isaac Klein said everybody was welcome. Joseph Klein, after sending that message, he arrived at the Klein home as well. So that's kind of how it was in the afternoon. At around 10 o'clock that morning, Sister Elizabeth Ryan, a member of the congregation of the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word, left St. Mary's Hospital. She was a sister at the orphanage, and she had been in the hospital and in the city collecting provisions. So she started heading back to the orphanage. And the sisters there begged her not to go, but she said she had to go because she had the provisions in the wagon. And she said, if I don't go, they're not going to have their supper. She didn't know that whether she returned or not, there would be no more suppers at that orphanage. So Sister Elizabeth Ryan returned to the orphanage. At around 5 o'clock, John Blagden took a reading, and the winds were blowing, sustained winds, blowing at 5 minutes or more at that velocity, where 80 was 84, but gusts were at 104. And so he took the measurements the way he was supposed to, and then he went back into the Weather Bureau office. But then he noted the winds had dramatically increased. And he said, I don't have to measure again, but my gosh. He said, he saw a horse being blown down the street. And then a giant telephone pole came and speared the horse. And he said, I'm going to go check the readings again. And he went up to the top of the building. But the winds were so strong that every instrument used to measure the velocity had been ripped from the top of the building. That's why we don't know the strength of the winds during the great 1900 storm. So the storm would have been bad if it would have just ended at that point because of the high winds and the rising water. But it didn't end. It was at 7:30 that when the great tidal surge struck the South Shore. And it hit with such force that houses fell upon houses. And these waves crashed into houses and whole blocks of homes. And inside those houses, there were people, families huddled together. When a single moment of time were sent from the safety and security of their houses into the dark, tumultuous waters.
In the relative time this is all happening, this tragedy is pretty rapid. Once the winds and the waves came together with this cacophony of horror, the devastation that was occurring with the destruction of the homes and the poor people inside those homes and houses,
and then decisions having to be made about whether you're going to stay there or whether you're going to go. Think of the responsibility of parents with children saying, what do we do? Isaac Klein reported that when that tidal surge came in at his house, which was elevated, the water rose 4 feet in 4 seconds. So if you had a small child, 4 feet is, that's over the head of a small child. But that was what was happening.
When we go past midnight, you have like the dark night of Galveston soul occurring right then. All hell is descended on the island, and as we move into the morning hours, people trying to survive any way they can, some not knowing if they're going to, nobody thought they were going to survive. And somehow, through God's grace, many did. But more than 8,000. We're talking about 6,000 minimum is the figure, but the figure actually is much higher.
It's much higher. It's much higher. And what What I feel, what's in my heart about this is that we can say 8,000, and that's incredible. That's
From
horrific.
37,000 people, that's almost 1 out of every 4 people or more.
Yeah, but those are individuals. They're people, and each one of those 8,000 had a story. And that's what's so incredible. It's the individual stories. It's what everybody went through.
When the sun broke open in the dawn of September the 9th, 1900, what did we see?
Well, actually, it was around midnight when the winds died down and the water receded. And it was at midnight that a bright full moon came out. And that's when the people could first start to get a glimpse of what had happened in looking around just by the light of the moon. And in some cases, if they were fortunate enough to be still be in their home, they looked out. And can you imagine? I mean, like every day you can look out the front of your residence and it's whatever you see, the houses, the whatever.
Yes, ma'am.
But that morning, when people looked out, maybe there was nothing, all the way to the beach, nothing, everything gone. Now, when the great tidal surge hit on the South Shore and buildings went crashing, the debris comprised pieces of houses, pianos, pots, pans, cats, dogs, people. That wall of debris started traveling together, knocking down almost everything in its path. On 25th Street, that great wall of debris hit the Rosenberg home. It was a home for what we used to call a home for old ladies. But it hit that grand structure, which is still there today, and it stopped. And at different places along the route, that wall of debris was stopped. And when it did, it created like a dike protecting the homes behind it. That's why we have the Silk Stocking District and in other places.
The East End was protected more so that way.
Well, most of the East End coming from the east and the south, that was the hardest hit. But once you got in there, and that wall of debris wrapped itself around St. Mary's Hospital. Now, all of the original buildings of St. Mary's Hospital that were wooden, they were destroyed, and they ended up being in this debris wall that was 2 stories tall in some places. But the brick structure by Nicholas Clayton survived, and that's where the wall of debris stopped there, and then it zigzagged around. And Daisy Thorne and others who were on the other side, not the city side, but the Gulf side of this wall, that night wanted to climb over this wall. And she recalled trying to get over this wall and then hearing someone scream from within the wall of debris, and then trying to move things to help get somebody out. But every time she moved something here, then something there fell and somebody else screamed. So she went over the wall and went into the city.
I don't know how much of Galveston's city fathers or administrative officials, the mayor and such and so, police chiefs, fire marshals, may have survived the storm, but somehow Galveston found a way September 9th, 10th to gradually start picking up, moving forward, collecting the awful chore and picking up the job necessary to collect the deceased, taking animals, having to find a way to take and
well, they had to
care for these bodies.
Dispose of the bodies.
I didn't want to use the word dispose.
Well, that's what they had to do because they didn't want to have the disease, the pestilence from this. So what they did at first, they set up a morgue, and so that they could start identifying people. And so they set up a morgue, it filled. They set up a second morgue, it filled. They set up a third morgue, it filled. They said, this isn't working. So after that, they decided to put the bodies on a barge and take the barge out to sea for burial. Now, they put 800 bodies on that first barge. That was a man who went up to Father Kerwin, who was the local Catholic priest, and he said, Father Kerwin, I can't believe I'm going to do this, but I've got to put my mother-in-law on this barge. Would you please help me, and would you pray with me? And so Father Kerwin said he would. So he helped the man put the body on the barge, and they prayed. And next day, actually it was 2 days later, the man goes running up to Father Kerwin, and he said, Father Kerwin, my mother-in-law is back. And Father Kerwin just related it to the stress of the situation. He said, it's okay. He said, no, they're all back. And they were, because the bodies, improperly weighted, were now washing on the shore.
Yeah, my great-grandfather, Anton Hansen, was 16 years old, and he was actually a part of that body collection. He didn't talk about it much either, and I was too young to really ever talk to him. Anecdotally, I had heard later that he would describe that they would wrap shirts around their faces and douse it with, if they had any kind of whiskey or anything, and that the rough thing was having to use pickaxes for the large horses and things like to try to get thing in a position to where you can actually manhandle and place on and get into a position to dispose of those remains. Miss Linda, when did Galveston, in our closing moments on this show, start 1905 and further developing a sense of stability and then moving forward? And then, of course, we developed the seawall right after that.
Well, I think it's a real tribute to the resiliency of the people of Galveston, because immediately after the storm, things started happening. I mean, stores opened. Things were moving.
Really?
Yes.
That's awesome.
Yes. Also, for example, the orphanage had been destroyed. 1 year later, 1 year after the storm, a brand new orphanage opened. I mean, considering the economic destruction as well, that was just incredible. Now, my grandfather lived to be 88 years old. In the last 2 years of his life, he couldn't tell you what day of the week it was, what month it was. And most of the time, he didn't recognize his wife of more than 50 years. But whenever it would start to rain and the winds would pick up, he could tell you the story of the 1900 storm as though it had just happened yesterday, because no disease of the mind was strong enough to erase the memory of that storm.
Miss Linda McDonald, there's a great website. I know you've had a big part of helping to develop that. It's the simply 1900storm.com, 1900storm.com. Unbelievable resources and even some moving images, some of the very first that I believe Thomas Edison's group was a part of, coming down to help memorialize.
Yes. Mr. Smith came down and took some just priceless images.
What are the lessons, aside from building a seawall, that Galveston has learned, that the nation has learned on this still most deadly natural disaster in American history? And what are the lessons we're in danger of forgetting?
Well, when I think about the 1900 storm...
And better not forget.
Yes. And I think about lessons, I'm, again, reminded of my grandfather. And I asked him about talking about the 1900 storm. I said, should we do that? I mean, it's horrible. I mean, it's just horrific. The images, the death, the destruction. I said, should we really relive this? Mm-hmm. And my grandfather said, absolutely. Absolutely. He said, because when you know the story of the great 1900 storm, he said, then every night before you go to bed, you hug your family and you tell the people that you care about that you love them. But he said, then the next morning, if you wake up and you're fortunate enough to still be in your bed with your family around you and you're in your own house, then you get down on your knees and you thank God, because it could all be changed. It could all be gone overnight, the way it was one weekend in September in 1900 in Galveston.
Amen. Miss Linda McDonald, we love you. We'll have you back. You and Mr. Bill, one of my favorites. Charles McCullough here. Tell the people that you love them, and never let a day go by. That's the lesson from all of these tragedies of life. Charles McCullough here. We're looking forward to having Miss Linda and Big Bill back down the line. For Nate Stockard, CMC Hour Talk. We'll be back next Saturday at 9 a.m. right here on AM 1540 KGBC Galveston, Nassau Bay, Houston.